Thank you for joining us for From Idea to Implementation, a Ranked Choice Voting and Voting Systems Symposium. Our third session, RCV Case Studies and Future Successes, will begin shortly. My name is Chris Hughes. I'm a staff attorney with FairVote and liaison with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. I will be your moderator for this session. A few housekeeping matters are needed before we get started. Participants have been muted for this webinar to reduce audio interference since we have a large number of attendees. If you have technical issues, please use the question option to send a message to the organizer so we may try to assist. We have one handout for session 3, which is available in the Handouts tab of the control panel. To expand or minimize the control panel, click the orange arrow of your webinar taskbar. If you have a question or comment regarding the session, please type that message in the question box. Session 3 will be about 45 minutes, followed by a brief question and answer period. Questions we are unable to address during this live session will be answered in a follow-up document, which we will email to attendees and also post with a recording of this session on the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center website within a couple of weeks of the symposium. Now, let's welcome Gary Bartlett, Director of the Resource Center, to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Chris. For those that are not familiar with the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, we provide a compilation of best practices and first-hand experiences from jurisdictions that have used this method of voting with a focus on election administration, since that is our background. The website, www.rankedchoicevoting.org, and the overall project serve as resources for voters, election administrators, policy makers, candidates, and others. The Resource Center continues to evolve, as does Ranked Choice Voting. Both have gone from idea to implementation, and we hope these resources and sessions help you and others improve our democracy and the conduct of elections. I have known the panelists for session 3 for many, many years, and I'm very excited to have them as part of our symposium. Through their research, legal knowledge, and efforts for election excellence, these 3 individuals have made significant contributions to the conduct of elections in our country. I will be introducing them in the order that they are presenting. Dr. Robert Montjoy is a professor of the University of New Orleans and professor emeritus at Auburn University. He has written extensively on elections administration and serves on several boards. We are also proud to have him as he serves on our advisory board for the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center. He will discuss findings from his case studies on ranked choice voting. Robert Joyce is the Edwin Hinsdale Distinguished Professor of Public Law and Government at the School of Government at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where his work is concentrated in the law of elections, education, and employer-employee relations. Bob is the author of the North Carolina Precinct Manual, a training guide used by county boards of elections and election officials across North Carolina. A graduate of UNC and Harvard Law Schools, he has authored numerous articles, including redistricting of local governments. Would North Carolina have looked as bad as Florida on election night in 2000? And I helped him with that. And the last contested election in America. Doug Chapin is the director of the Program for Excellence in Election Administration at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Previously, he served 10 years as director of election initiatives for the Pew Center on States, during which he lobbied successfully for the enactment of military and overseas voting reforms and upgrades to the nation's voter registration systems. Prior to serving with Pew, Doug was an attorney specializing in elections and ethics law and served as elections counsel to Democrats on the U.S. Senate Rules Committee. I could say much more about each of these gentlemen, but I'd rather you hear from them. Please welcome Dr. Robert Montjoy to provide our first presentation.
Okay, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. All right. Well, I'm glad to be here, and I'm going to talk a bit about what Anita Chadha, David Kimball, and I are learning from some case studies and data analysis so far. This is clearly a work in progress, but I think we can make some generalizations that I hope people will find useful. I've just switched the slide here, so if people don't see it, call me or something.
Actually, Dr. Montjoy, we're seeing your notes and so forth, so you may need to switch the view.
Okay, yeah, all right. I'll don't mind you seeing the notes, but I will.
We just can't see your slides very well because it's smaller.
Okay. Can you see that now?
That's in full screen now. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, it was in presenter's view, and so now it's in. I just have to remember my notes. Anyway, I think it's interesting to look at the background because ranked choice voting has been used quite a few places in this nation before. It seems to have sort of petered out in the 1950s, and we want to look at it and say, is this the new situation is different? First place, a good bit of the usage before was proportional representation, which is important, and is certainly being used today, for example, in Cambridge. But that's not the primary usage today. As best we can tell, the reasons for discontinuance in the past have been a couple. One is it threatens some powerful interest, particularly the role of parties in the process. Parties had been used to controlling the nomination process, and ranked choice voting opens it up to other people. And also, it was somewhat impractical with the lever voting machines that were dominant at the time. Now there's a lot of renewed interest in it with multiple differences, multiple jurisdictions working under very different circumstances. Today, most of the usage is in single winner elections, but Cambridge is continuing to do proportional representation. Now, ranked choice voting can do either. Combining ranked choice voting with proportional representation obviously makes the explanation more complicated. Further, today, most of the places that are adopting it seem to be using nonpartisan elections. And of course, there's technological development. We're not using the old lever machines anymore, and we have equipment that can handle a ranked choice ballot, and the new equipment is being developed as we go. So I'd like to say something about the adoption process. Clearly, there are external advocates when it's adopted. That is, the election office is not the primary advocate. The adoption includes some important policy decisions. Certainly, the local governing body has a critical role to play. That's usually the city council, although county have also looked at it. And then, of course, state law is particularly important because state law constrains the options available to a local jurisdiction. In this, the role of the election official is generally at this point information on implementation rather than the effects of ranked choice voting. Policymakers want to know, well, first place, what is it? Which is a good reason why election officials ought to become involved and informed, even if they're not immediately considering it, because they need to be able to answer that question. Then people want to know, can it be implemented in this jurisdiction? The answer is almost always yes. It just takes some recognizing of the circumstances of that jurisdiction. Then what does it cost and does it save money? And I'll come back to that point a little later. So ranked choice voting has worked in a variety of circumstances, and I think it's important to recognize that for two reasons, which I'll mention. For example, it's used in proportional representation in Cambridge, Massachusetts. If you've already heard about Minneapolis. I expect if you tuned in earlier, they use Excel spreadsheets to convey the whole vote record and then to manipulate the count to produce the ranked choice outcome. St. Paul has done hand counting. North Carolina did statewide elections, and there are others that we haven't gotten to yet, but there are plenty of different systems. And I think that's important to recognize. One, there's flexibility to meet local state requirements. One size is not required for all systems. Second, election officials have to be involved in the design of the system, because only the election officials know the peculiar characteristics of their jurisdiction and their system. And the point I'd like to add, though, it's particularly important to consider multiple options when adopting. I think it's danger to just look at one other jurisdiction and attempt to replicate it at your own jurisdiction, because they're different and there are more than one way to do it, and that's should be taken into consideration. So implementation, I've written a lot about implementation in general, and one rule is that new systems can always have unintended consequences. You're familiar, I'm sure, with the butterfly ballot in Florida and the vote centers, which have been certainly in both Denver and Phoenix. After a very successful initial implementation in Laramie County, Colorado, there were some problems in initial implementation, which have been overcome since then. Point being that the initial implementation is always a bump to get over. It's critically important to educate voters, candidates, and the press, because they're always critical elements. Most people say they can understand how to cast the ballot, although there is some anecdotal evidence about a small increase in spoiled ballots. The explanation of how it's counted is a bit more difficult, but there are plenty of good examples out there on the websites of the jurisdictions that are using it now. Biggest problem seems to be understanding the possible switch in winners from the first to the last round. I'll go beyond that just a little bit. If we look at ranked choice voting and compare it with the alternatives, the most common types are plurality elections, which there's one election, whoever has the most votes wins, and there's no requirement for majority. What I call two election systems are such as a primary with a general, or a general with a runoff, or top two system, then produce majorities by cutting out the number of candidates down to two, and then ranked choice voting. All produce the same result if a candidate has a majority on the first round. So the difference comes in what happens if no one has a majority. Two election systems cut candidates from near the top, that is, from the third place down. Those candidates are eliminated. Ranked choice voting cut from the bottom up through more rounds, so it's not just one sequence. So we have to ask the question, a majority of what? The two election systems produce a majority on the second round, the second election. There may be, and usually are, different set of voters in that second election. They are responding to somewhat different campaigns. And the second round may have more or less voters than the first, depending on scheduling. Ranked choice voting produces a majority on the last round. That may or may not be a majority of those who voted initially. Same thing is true with the two election system, but it is drawn from the same set of voters, and it is responding to the same campaign as in ranked choice voting. Either system can switch winners from the first to the last round. Ranked choice voting favors candidates with broad support as opposed to candidates with intense narrow support. Turnout seems to me so far is heavily influenced by scheduling. That is, combining an election with a general election is simply going to produce a greater turnout regardless of the system that is used. Does ranked choice voting save money? And the answer, I think, is it depends. We haven't done a systematic and detailed analysis of a number of jurisdictions yet, but Yes, it avoids the cost of a second election, but there's certainly startup costs for a new system. There may be equipment or software, there's staff time, and there's education and training. The point I want to make is it's dangerous to promise quick savings in the adoption process because it puts pressure maybe to scrimp on preparation to meet the commitment for quick savings. And so I think it's an important thing to do a thorough job in the first election and then worry about savings later. And there we go. So the role of election officials includes, when the jurisdiction is considering adoption, election official is generally an advisor to the policymaking body and a designer, helping to make sure the system does what it wants to do in that jurisdiction. But then you shift over to implementation. The election official is still a designer because you're tinkering with the system forever, but it also becomes a manager, a trainer, and an educator. And that educator role is critically important. There are threats to implementation, and I always say it's a mistake to overlook the threats to implementation. There are always threats to implementation in any new policy area. There have been a few discontinuances after implementation, after adoption in the current era. And I think one of the main reasons was there was pretty much marginal support for adoption in the first place. It was more dissatisfaction with the previous system and sort of a lack of a broad understanding of ranked choice voting. The system, it seems, is always vulnerable, most vulnerable on the first implementation. Why? Change is always difficult in any system. Losers can always blame the system as opposed to not getting enough votes, enough support. There's possible disruption to the party system where the elections are partisan. And the voters will blame the system for unrelated problems. That is, if you have long lines, even if it has nothing to do with ranked choice voting, it's going to get blamed for that until voters get used to the system and how it operates. So that's just a way of saying it's very important to be very thorough in especially in the first implementation. Preparation involves, I think, a bunch of things. One is recognition that implementation is distinct from adoption. It's important to consult with more than one ranked choice voting jurisdiction. You can't expect an increase in the number of candidates. That's what we found pretty generally so far. It's critically important to train staff and poll workers, but it's also critically important to educate voters, candidates, and the press because they're part of the change. Of course, it's important to be transparent. It's important to expect and prepare for problems. You may not have any, but it's always important to be prepared just in case. And it's important to communicate. And that's the conclusion to my show, and I'll look forward to questions later.
I believe that North Carolina is the only state in the country that has conducted a ranked choice voting election on a statewide basis. I had a marginal hand in that working with Gary Bartlett when he was the state elections director here in North Carolina. To think about how North Carolina got to that point, I'd like to focus us for a moment not on ranked choice voting, but on regular partisan elections, the kind of election I think most of us are familiar with, and that is by far the overwhelmingly most common election here in North Carolina. It is the kind of election where there are primary elections conducted for the Republicans and for the Democrats, and in our state also the Libertarians, who marshal very few votes. In the primaries, the Republicans, by voting, choose their nominee to go into the general election, and the Democrats, by voting, choose their nominee to go into the general election. And then the general election is the face-off between the nominees of the parties. I think people generally are very familiar with that standard kind of procedure. Let's think for a moment about a particular office in North Carolina, which is the office of judge on the North Carolina Supreme Court. For more than 100 years, that kind of seat on the North Carolina Supreme Court was an elective office, and the election was conducted through this very standard, regular, partisan election process. If you wish to be elected to a seat on the Supreme Court, you would run in the Republican primary or in the Democratic primary in May, and then the winners of the primaries would face each other in the general election in November. The winner would be elected to a nice long 8-year term, and then 8 years later the whole process would happen again. That's a standard partisan election used to elect judges to the North Carolina Supreme Court for more than a century. Think, though, for a moment about what happens if a judge resigns before his term is up. Let's say a judge resigns 3 years into an 8-year term. A vacancy is created. How is the vacancy to be filled? The answer in North Carolina is that we do not wait until the end of the 8-year term to have a new election. Instead, we have a new election at the time of the next regular election. In this case, where the judge has resigned 3 years into an 8-year term, the next regular election comes up at the end of the 4th year of the 8-year term. So, no problem. You have primaries and a general election at the 4-year mark instead of at the 8-year mark, and you carry on with a new judge elected at the 4-year mark. But now suppose one more thing. Suppose that the judge who created the vacancy by resigning resigned after the May primary at the 4-year mark. That is, the vacancy that he creates is created after the primary, but before the general election. It's too late to have primaries, but not too late to have the general election. Again, no problem. The law provided that in such a case, the Republican Party Executive Committee and the Democratic Party Executive Committee simply would name their nominees. Those nominees would then go on the November general election ballot, just as if they had won a primary, and the winner would be elected judge. So that's the way it worked for election to North Carolina Supreme Court, North Carolina appellate courts for a century or more, just as it did for the standard run of offices such as governor. But then, a big change. In the 1990s, the General Assembly put into place a major change. No longer would Supreme Court judges be elected on a partisan basis. No longer would there be a Republican primary and a Democratic primary. Instead, all judges would run without party affiliation in a nonpartisan primary, and the two top vote-getters would face each other in the general election. Okay, still no problem. Instead of partisan primaries, you now had one nonpartisan primary and then a general election. But then a problem developed. A member of the North Carolina Supreme Court resigned in 2004 after the primary election, but when there was still time to have a general election. But who was to pick the nominees for the general election? In this nonpartisan election, it would be inappropriate for the Republican Party Executive Committee and the Democratic Party Executive Committee to pick nominees. There was no one to pick nominees. So, no nominees were picked. Everyone who wished to run for judge on the Supreme Court simply signed up, 8 lawyers ran, and on general election day, there was a one-election, plurality, winner-take-all vote. The top vote-getter got just 23% of the vote, but was elected and took his seat on the court. The system in place permitted a candidate to win a seat on the state's highest court with less than a quarter of the vote. This was, not surprisingly, seen as undesirable, and in 2006, the General Assembly amended the statute. In such a circumstance, the general election would be not a plurality winner-take-all election, but would instead be conducted using ranked choice voting. So now hold that thought. The possibility of a statewide ranked choice voting election springing up unexpectedly when an appeals court judge suddenly leaves the bench. Hold on to the thought about what it would mean for the state elections board at the drop of a hat to be the first in the nation to be called upon for a statewide ranked choice voting election. And here's a spoiler alert, that's exactly what happened a couple of years later, but hold that thought. The 2006 statute, which gave rise to this statewide election possibility, also did another thing. It provided for the possibility of pilot ranked choice voting elections on a localized, small-scale basis, and in 2007, 2 North Carolina municipalities, Hendersonville and Cary, volunteered to be the guinea pigs, and their municipal elections that year were conducted by ranked choice voting. In 2008, with the Hendersonville and Cary experiences salted away, the General Assembly amended the ranked choice voting pilot statute to require that the State Board of Elections develop goals, standards, and criteria for implementation for future ranked choice voting elections, and that's where I came in. The new legislation directed the State Board to work with the UNC School of Government in that effort, and that was me. A big issue that had to be addressed was the fact that the certified direct record electronic equipment was not capable of all the steps necessary in the ranked choice voting process. The State Board staff developed a workaround using an Excel spreadsheet, and I provided the legal opinion that that method met the state certification requirements, principally because there was no option. So by 2010, the state had the Hendersonville and Cary experiences, and it had in place the documentation of goals, standards, and procedures. Then came the bombshell. The same problem that had arisen in 2004, an appellate judge seat had become vacant after the primary, but before the general election, arose again, this time on the North Carolina Court of Appeals rather than the Supreme Court, but the rules were the same. A judge resigned after the primary, but before the general election. This time, 13 lawyer candidates filed. But instead of a plurality winner-take-all election, North Carolina conducted a statewide ranked choice voting election. A ranked choice voting election in which almost 2 million voters voted, an unprecedented statewide multi-million voter ranked choice voting election. As I wrote to a colleague at the time, it was ranked choice voting without warning, statewide, 100 counties, all at once, conducting a ranked choice voting election for one seat, while at the same time running a regular election for federal, state, and county offices. The state board staff and the county board staffs pulled it off. In that election, the candidate with the most first choice votes got 395,000 first choice votes, and the next candidate got 296,000 first choice votes. But the first choice leader got only 141,000 second choice votes, and the number 2 guy in first choice votes got 247,000 second choice votes, enough to allow him to win. The ranked choice voting experiment in North Carolina came to a close when the North Carolina General Assembly let the pilot ranked choice voting option for local government elections lapse and changed back to the plurality winner-take-all method for judicial elections in 2013. Why did the General Assembly do that? I do not know, of course, but here is my guess. For one thing, voters were a bit confused because the ranked choice voting election sprang up out of nowhere because of the judicial vacancy situation and applied to only one relatively low-profile race. More importantly, I think, was the timing of the counting. In North Carolina, we have traditionally been very quick to report results on election night with precinct-level counting and an efficient reporting system. Because the technology used in our direct record electronic and optical scan systems, that could not be the case with ranked choice voting. Only first choice votes could be tabulated that traditional way. Since no candidate got a majority of first choice votes, the ranked choice voting instant runoff second choice counting had to kick in. That could not be done on election night, and the result was a delay in reporting the results of the ranked choice voting election. It unfairly made ranked choice voting look slow. I believe that that technological software problem no longer exists, but for the moment, there is no North Carolina law permitting ranked choice voting. That is the North Carolina experience.
Thank you very much, everybody. My name is Doug Chapin with the University of Minnesota Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I don't think I'm going to go into the same kind of depth that Professor Montjoy and Professor Joyce did, but just want to take a few minutes to talk about sort of the lay of the land and the issues that we're going to see arising in the ranked choice voting sphere in the next couple, 3 years across the country. Heard about some case studies, especially the one in North Carolina today. Want to suggest that we are on the cusp of probably one of the greatest case studies of ranked choice voting in this country to date, and that is the ongoing, what I call the Battle of Maine, over statewide ranked choice voting in that state. I won't try and recap the legal maneuvering because I'm not sure I will get it right, but in essence, the people have voted for ranked choice voting. Legislators have tried through both legislation and litigation to stop it. And after a recent court ruling, ranked choice voting is again on in Maine for the June primary across the state. It is true, as Professor Joyce suggests, that Maine is not the first state to run a statewide ranked choice voting election, but I think it's fair to say that this will be the highest profile that we've seen to date at the state level. We'll be dealing with state candidates from governor down to the state legislature, and setting aside the political fights and the litigation that threatened to tie up ranked choice voting in Maine, it does pose several really interesting questions going forward for ranked choice voting, at least at the statewide level. The first is how exactly the count will work. In Maine, they're going to transport ballots from local communities to the state capitol in Augusta, where the Secretary of State will count those ballots. There has been discussion in Maine about how exactly to do that and who exactly will pay for it. The proposal seems to be that law enforcement will bring the ballots to Augusta, much as they would in a statewide recount, and that state funds will be made available to do that. The second is how long the count will take. I mean, given the pretty intense resistance, at least in the legislature, to ranked choice voting, I know that both the Secretary of State as well as folks in the ranked choice voting field are very concerned about how well the count will go and how quickly it will go. I think that to the extent folks across the nation are watching how ranked choice voting will play out, are going to be looking very carefully at Maine and will likely take both positive aspects and cautionary tales from that experience in the short, medium, and long term. As someone who's watched these fights across the country, I think it's fair to say, or fair to wonder, whether or not the Maine experience will actually change any minds. My experience has been that most folks who don't like ranked choice voting tend not necessarily to be persuaded, and that folks who do like it are usually willing to overlook either implementation challenges or other problems that arise. I do think, as Dr. Montjoy suggested, that often that's a factor in whether or not, first of all, ranked choice voting is adopted in a community, and then why, if at all, it is rescinded going forward because of the quick and deep division of opinion on the issue. So I think everyone will be watching Maine to see how the state prepares, how ballots are transported to the state capitol, how results are tabulated, and how long the entire process takes. And then, of course, what that means for the future of ranked choice voting beyond the June primary. Beyond that main event, I think just a couple of other things that have already been touched on here today, and maybe a couple others that haven't. I do think in following the news across the country, we're starting to see at least new rationales being advanced for why ranked choice voting might be a good thing for a community. You hear about political representation, you hear about cost effectiveness. In the Minneapolis suburb of St. Louis Park, Minnesota, St. Louis Park recently voted to move to ranked choice voting for their elections. And one of the major arguments there was the desire to make the local government more representative of the community across all kinds of different lines, racial lines, cultural lines, what have you, that just as you hear the argument that ranked choice voting can make elected officials more politically representative of the electorate, St. Louis Park seems to be interested in making elected officials also culturally and other representative of the electorate. And so that's worth watching to see, A, how well it goes, and B, whether or not there are other communities across the country facing similar real or perceived challenges that they believe are addressed and solvable by ranked choice voting. The other issue which both presenters have already touched on, and I think is really important to think about going forward, is the role that technology plays in ranked choice voting. You have the obvious role that voting tabulation plays in the process. The city of Minneapolis has had to work to adapt its voting technology to work with the number of candidates who get involved in the various city campaigns, and thinking about the process of not only counting votes, but then tabulating the results, moving beyond Excel spreadsheets and other sort of back office solutions to get a result, is something that will be really important going forward. I think the other thing that not a lot of people pay attention to, and that I think is important based on some of the work that we've seen on civic tech across the country, is how to use the same kind of tools that we use to tell voters where their polling place is and what's on their ballot, to help them understand ranked choice voting and what different rankings look like at the polling place. I think that advocates and the media have done a really nice job of explaining how ranked choice voting works in elections. I don't know necessarily that individual campaigns or individual voters have access to the kinds of tools that they need to make those kinds of decisions. I think just as we've seen a huge leap forward in polling place locators and other ballot information tools, I think we're, especially as more and more jurisdictions adopt and consider ranked choice voting, we're going to see more and better tools for helping voters make their decisions in a ranked choice voting environment, whether it's recognizing whether when candidates either have official or unofficial agreements to recommend one another for ranks, whether there are opportunities to search for clusters of candidates who share an individual voter's views on one or more issues, and what have you. But thinking about how technology, not just in the polling place and at the election office, but also in the palm of a voter's hand or on a voter's desk or laptop, is really important going forward. I feel like, as someone who follows the news across the country, that ranked choice is really having a moment. I mean, obviously, the Maine election is going to be a big opportunity for ranked choice voting supporters to make their case for the process. But I think, by the same token, as more and more jurisdictions see what other communities are doing, see their experiences with ranked choice voting, and think about how to adapt it to their own voters and community needs, I think we're on the cusp of some really interesting and exciting developments in the field of ranked choice voting. Thank you.
Thanks so much to our panelists, Doug, Bob, and Robert. Let's move right into the Q&A segment now. Please remember to type your questions in the question box of the control panel if any come to you as we go through. So let's start with a question that was directed to Robert about his methodology. How did you determine that there was an increase in the number of candidates in RCV elections? Did you control for other factors such as open contests and other factors that might inflate the number of candidates?
Yes, David Kimball and I he had built most of this data set, and I've added to it So we've got a number of cities and a number of contests, and used a method of controlling for change over, measuring change over time. So you're not just looking at the straight comparison. You're looking at whether the change in one jurisdiction is bigger than or different from a change in another jurisdiction. And one of the variables was whether or not you were tied in with another campaign, whether you were on a general election or a primary. So there were a lot of controls. And this was a paper we did at the Southern Political Science Association, and we're continuing to work on the data. But it was the strongest finding that we had was that the number of candidates tends to go up.
All right. And so you mentioned David Kimball. Could you talk a bit more about the work you did with him and the work you did in looking back at some of his research on turnout in ranked choice voting elections?
Well, I don't know where to start, but yeah. Well, he and I, he's been working in this area for a long time. I've known about him before we actually got together. It just was a time that I learned he was doing this work and collecting the data for it at a time that I was collecting the same thing. And so we just had a conversation and decided to join forces and have gone forward there. He was particularly looking at the turnout issue, which I was not. And so far, we've not, at least in the research I've done with him, had not found in a statistically significant way an increase in overall turnout, nor is there a decrease. But that's why I say that other factors seem to make more difference, such as what's going on around the RCV election, the timing of it, and things of that nature.
Got it. Thanks. So now I've got a question for Doug. How do you think academics and researchers can determine where necessary and then promote best practices in terms of policy for adoption of RCV and procedures for implementation?
Well, I think one of the things we can do is what we do with any reform you see in the field. I think there's a lot to be said for talking to election officials themselves. We're seeing a lot of this in voter registration work. We're starting to see this with some of the cybersecurity work across the country. I think there are real opportunities, and this webinar is a great example of that, where you bring in the folks who've actually done it and allow them to talk about what challenges they faced and how they addressed those challenges going forward. I think in many ways, finding a way to get beyond focusing on ranked choice solely for its impact on outcomes and starting to look at its impact on election administration itself is incredibly helpful. My experience throughout my career has been that election officials are incredibly open to anything that will make not only their jobs easier, but also make the experience better for their voters. And so finding a way to think through how do I set up my ballot? How do I program my machines? How do I talk to my voters about the process? How do I communicate to the media and the interested public what the results are? Gives us an insight into what works, what doesn't, and what needs to vary from community to community in a way that communities that do decide they want to adopt or think about ranked choice voting have more than just a theoretical debate about what impact it will have on outcomes going forward.
Well, and hopefully the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center is helping start that conversation in a lot of these cities.
Absolutely, and again, this webinar and the material that you all are putting together really is invaluable in being a kind of, it's a little bit like the clickbait you see online. You know, so you're interested in ranked choice voting, now what? You all are answering the now what question. Yeah. So it's really helpful to have these kinds of materials and these kinds of discussions available for the field.
So to follow up a bit on that, Doug, I'd like for you to answer this question, and Bob, if you have anything you'd like to add too. When you're looking at the technical details of ranked choice voting, things like ballot interpretation, things like defining how the algorithm is run, do you think that should be provided in statute, in the law passed by the legislature or the city council, or something that is done through a rulemaking, with rulemaking authority being given to election administrators or other authorities?
Well, for me, that's an easy answer. I mean, I am a big believer in not engaging in statutory lock. I think we see that with technology all the time. It's a tough balance. I think the legislature has to give some guidance as to the parameters involved. But my preference, especially as someone who works with election officials on the kind of day-to-day make it work approach, I would much rather have more flexibility to iterate and debug, if you will, the process, rather than rely on the legislature to spell out every eventuality and lay out exactly how the process should work. Now, I realize that an elected official might feel very different, but for me as an election geek, I would rather see it done through rulemaking or policy documents than statute.
This is Bob Joyce. I completely agree with that. I think we have an advantage in North Carolina in having State Board of Elections and the State Board of Elections staff who have the authority to instruct the county boards of elections in how they are to go about conducting all kinds of elections, and so have some inherent authority in this area with respect to ranked choice voting if we ever come back to it. I am hopeful that the technology, software development, machine development, and all can come along in a way that would undo a lot of the issues. It seems to me that if you have standardized technology, that you can write the procedures and regulations to meet that in a way that should be satisfactory to everybody. A stumbling block for us in 2010 was to make sure that the procedures that we came up with were consistent with the certification requirements for the machinery, and it wasn't 100% sure that that was so.
Great, thanks so much.
This is Robert. I'd like just to add my 2 bits that yes, I think for all the reasons suggested, avoid sticking the details in the statute.
Mm-hmm. So I'm turning back to you, Robert, and your research. Can you talk a bit more about the cities where you have done these case studies for ranked choice voting and where you're thinking of going next?
Well, we've been to Cambridge. I went to Cambridge. Anita Chadha and I went to Minneapolis and St. Paul. We're looking now at. Actually, want to look at some places that have either thinking about trying it to see how that process works, or have tried it and decided to not do it. And I think Pierce County in Washington, I've done some reading about that process, like newspapers and things at the time. But I think it's important to go out there and find out what happened there. And then, of course, there are, the California cities that have been doing it for quite a while. There's Santa Fe, which has just recently moved in that direction. So it's just a matter. But I'm retiring from the university at the end of May. Well, actually, I guess the end of June. So I'm going to have a lot more time to do this. And I hope to get around to several sites.
Great. So can you talk too a bit about, we had a question from Marnie McGrath, who is the city clerk in Ferndale, Michigan, where they've been trying to get RCV adopted or implemented for a while. Do you know of the cities that use ranked choice voting, which of those are administering elections at the local level and which ones have contracted with their counties to administer their RCV elections?
Off the top of my head, San Francisco, which of course is a unique case. I mean, I think it's the city that runs that. The Alameda, Oakland, California. I think they all of the 3 cities in that county contract with the county, and that's one of the reasons I want to go out there, because and talk to, and I've spoken to people at meetings and things, but talk a little bit about the role of the county in running both types of elections simultaneously. May be of interest to implementers.
Right.
Minneapolis runs its city election, and I'm trying. If you give me an hour to go dig it out of my notes, I can tell you more about this.
Sure.
Cambridge runs its election, I'm pretty sure.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just ad hoc. There's a mix, I guess, is what I'm saying, of contracting with the county or doing it locally, and it's worked both ways.
Right, and we can definitely get more detailed in the Q&A document that we send around in the next couple weeks as well with that answer. So the next one I'm seeing is a bit more of a theoretical question. So the question is, in general, RCV is more efficient, meaning there's fewer wasted votes compared to plurality elections. Is the efficiency of a voting system a good argument for one system over another? And I'm just going to throw that out to the panel, and whoever wants to go first, go ahead.
I don't think I quite get the question.
I think it's getting at, does the fact that more people's votes ultimately count at some stage of the election in an RCV election as opposed to a plurality election, is that a strong or a good argument to use when talking about something like ranked choice voting?
Well, I'll jump in and say that what you're really doing is measuring breadth of support. I mean, a lot of times either a 2-election system or a ranked choice system will produce the same result. But where they differ, one is you can put together a coalition around a very intense group of people, and then get down to where there's only 2 choices, and then voters have to make a choice between those 2 who may not have the broadest support. So I think the broader support argument is an argument in favor of ranked choice voting, because there you, as I said in my presentation, you're achieving majority by eliminating from the bottom up, and therefore keeping more voters involved in the process.
This is Doug. I'm wrestling with it. I understand the point. I certainly don't think that works with legislators, but then very few things do on this issue. I don't know if that's. I think maybe that motivates the organized public, who are then going to go out and make the case to other folks. I think probably focusing more on either likely outcomes like more responsiveness, better representation, and efficiency in the traditional sense that the counting process will be more efficient, perhaps, are going to be more solid than a theoretical argument that ranked choice is less inefficient than a plurality-based system. But I'm not a political scientist, nor do I play one on TV, so your mileage may vary.
Well, I agree with you. I think I wasn't responding to what would be good sales practice for the system. Although I will tell you an interesting experience. My wife and I yesterday went down to the waterfront in New Orleans to see tall ships that are visiting for the New Orleans 300th birthday, and bumped into a couple and visiting from Maine. And so I immediately asked them about ranked choice voting, and they were very excited about it. And the reason was the theoretical argument. So at least 2 people in Maine buy that argument.
Well, on Maine, it's been a pretty intense fight there to get RCV implemented, from passage in 2016, which had to happen at the ballot initiative level because there wasn't an appetite in the legislature to pass it legislatively. to, the legislature sending a question to the Maine Supreme Court to try and block implementation, to then passing a statute to stop it, and then finally the campaign there putting a people's veto of that law stopping ranked choice voting on the ballot for June. Do you think we're going to see these sorts of really drawn out fights over ranked choice voting in the future as it hopefully grows in adoption? And that's for everybody. I know it might be a lot to bite off, but I am curious to hear what you're all thinking about that.
I'm going to say yes in the short run, and then depending on the outcome, maybe no in the longer run. Yeah. We saw the fight in Santa Fe. Obviously, we've seen the fight in Maine. I think that at least in the meantime, as long as ranked choice voting is a relatively close question in communities, I think you're going to see this kind of resistance. I think that as more and more communities go to ranked choice voting and it becomes less unfamiliar to communities, that you'll see more and more places adopt it with less, if any, resistance. It's probably an imperfect analogy, but I think the spread of vote by mail is really instructive on this. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that I remember people referring to vote by mail somewhat pejoratively as the Oregon experiment. And now it's, very popular and exists in many, many places beyond just the state of Oregon. So I think in the short run, folks will continue to fight rearguard actions against ranked choice voting, but as it's more successful in more places, I think those things peter out in the long run. Again, your mileage may vary.
Doug, in Maine, what races will be conducted through RCV?
It's all state races, so it'll be everything that will be on a state ballot. The governor, the state legislature. So that's part of what makes it kind of another step forward. And one of the arguments that was made, and in fact, one of the reasons why it was pushed in Maine was because of the perception that the current governor, who was not a member of either party, ended up being essentially a compromise result of the plurality system. And so one of the arguments that I think that some members were making in Maine was that this was a way to restore the people's voice to people's elections. Now, whether or not that's true or even fair, I don't know, but that certainly was one of the arguments that was made. And so I think one of the things that folks will be watching will be to see what impact it has, not just on outcomes, but on sort of partisan lean in various seats.
And at the election, where there will be all these offices elected through RCV, will there be other offices on the ballot not RCV?
Yes, and those are the races that will be tallied in their home communities, unlike the ranked choice ballots, is my understanding.
Right.
So I think we're just about out of time. It's 3:29. I wish I would try to squeeze another question, but I don't think we'll be able to really do that now. Thanks so much to our panelists for getting on today and for this great discussion about ranked choice voting. We are going to work with all of our panelists, as mentioned previously, to provide answers to any of the questions we couldn't get to during the session. That document will be posted along with our recording in the coming weeks on our website, www.rankedchoicevoting.org. And please join us at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time this afternoon for our final session of the day, Session 4, the U.S. Election Assistance Commission certification process. Thanks so much.